Deaf telegraph operator inherited a frozen ferry boat for 1 penny. 6 runaway slaves were hiding below. The penny was in my left breast pocket when I walked down to the river. I could feel it through the wool, that particular weight a single coin has when it's the only thing in a pocket, how it settles against your ribs different from a full purse. Cold morning. January 1857, the Missouri River at a town called Harker's Crossing that barely deserved the name, 3 buildings and a livery and the telegraph office where I'd worked the past 11 years without once being thanked for it. The ferryman was dead. That was the business of it, at least at the start. His name was Dolph Vera, and I'd known him going on 8 years, the way you know a man in a small place, by what he does and what he doesn't do, by the angle he tips his hat, by whether he'll look you in the eye when he hands you your change. Dolph looked you in the eye. He was 63 and he'd had the ferry concession since before the war with Mexico, and he'd run it alone since his wife passed. He was not a friendly man, but he was an honest one, which in my experience is worth considerably more. He died on a Tuesday in the second week of January, fell through the ice checking the mooring lines, and they pulled him out alive, but he was gone before Friday morning. I was not at the burial. I don't go to burials. I have my reasons, and they are my own. What I didn't expect was the letter. It came through the territorial office in St. Joseph, official wax seal, and the postmaster, a man named Greel who disliked me for no reason I ever figured. He pushed it across the counter without meeting my eyes, same as always. I broke the seal standing in the street. The gist of it was this: Dolph Vera had no family. He'd left a will, written out in his own hand and witnessed by the county recorder. And in that will he left the ferry, the boat, the mooring, the concession license, and all associated equipment to one Callum Grier. That being me, for the consideration of 1 penny, said penny to be paid to the estate within 30 days or the conveyance to be considered void, and the property to revert to territorial jurisdiction. I read it twice. Then I folded it and put it in my coat. I didn't know why Dolph had done it. We weren't close men. We'd shared a bottle once, maybe twice, after the ice broke in spring, a kind of celebration that men who work rivers do when the thaw comes and the boats can move again. He knew I was deaf. He knew it, and he never made a thing of it, never exaggerated his mouth movements for me the way people do when they think they're being helpful and are mostly being condescending. He just talked at his normal pace, and if I caught it, I caught it, and if I didn't, he'd write it on whatever was to hand. That was about the extent of our friendship, but apparently it was enough for a ferry. The penny was from my coin dish on the windowsill, the little clay dish my mother made before she died. I picked the penny at random, put it in my pocket, and walked to the river. I want to tell you what the river looked like that morning, because you need to see it to understand anything that follows. The Missouri in January is not the Missouri in June. In June, it's wide and brown and loud, a working river full of purpose. In January, it's something else. It was frozen bank to bank that morning, a skin of gray-white ice that creaked and popped in the cold like a thing with opinions. The ferry was locked in it. Dolph's ferry, my ferry now, or almost, was a flat-bottomed cable ferry, maybe 50 feet stem to stern, wide enough for a wagon and team with room on either side to stand. The cable that ran it across the river was frozen too, the big hemp line sagging with ice, and the boat itself had drifted maybe 20 feet from its proper mooring before it froze solid, and that was where it sat, tilted perhaps 3 degrees to port, stuck. There was a small wheelhouse forward and a covered cargo hold amidships, and at the stern there was a rope locker and an anchor winch. All of it was gray and frosted. Smoke was coming from the wheelhouse. I stood on the bank and looked at that smoke for a long time. Dolph was dead. The boat was mine as of the penny in my pocket, and a letter I hadn't yet officially answered. Nobody should have been on that boat. The ice between the bank and the boat was maybe 2 feet thick where the ferry had been moored, and I walked it carefully, testing with each step, not because I was afraid, but because dying in the river in January seemed like a poor way to start owning something. I got to the boat's side and found the boarding plank frozen at an angle, and I climbed it, one hand on the railing, and stepped onto the deck. The deck planking was covered in a thin skin of frost, and my boots bit into it. I went to the wheelhouse first, pushed the door open. The stove was going, not blazing, carefully, barely, the way you feed a fire when you're trying not to make smoke. Someone had done that deliberately. There was a tin pot on the stove with water in it, not boiling, just warm, and there was a coffee sack folded flat on the floor as a mat. And on that mat there were the clear impressions of 2 people having sat or lain, and the impressions were warm. I stood in that wheelhouse and I looked at what was there, and what was not there, and I thought about it. Then I went to the cargo hold. The hatch was a heavy plank affair with an iron bar latch. The latch was latched from the outside, which meant either someone had locked the hatch from the outside on purpose or the people inside had found some other way to secure it. I lifted the bar. The smell came up first. Unwashed bodies, old fear, river mud, and something else, food that had been eaten cold because there'd been no fire down there. Then my eyes adjusted. There were 6 of them. They were ranged along the forward bulkhead, sitting or crouched, and every one of them was looking at me with the particular stillness of people who have decided that being still is the difference between living and dying. 2 men, a woman, an older man who might have been 60, a girl who was maybe 14, and a child of perhaps 4 or 5 years old who was pressed against the woman and watching me with enormous eyes. I stood at the top of the hatch ladder, and I looked at them and they looked at me. I want to say I knew right then what I was going to do. That would be a clean story and it would be a lie. What I knew right then was that 6 people were in the hold of my boat, and they were alive, and they were terrified, and they were runaways. I could see it in every line of them. The clothes that didn't match, the bundles that were everything they owned, the way the older man had his hand on something underneath his coat. And I was standing in the free state of Missouri about 14 miles north of the Kansas line, and the Fugitive Slave Act had been the law of the land for 7 years. I didn't move for what felt like a long time, but was probably 10 seconds. Then I came down the ladder. The woman moved first. She stepped in front of the child and the girl, putting her body between them and me, and she looked at me with a directness that I hadn't expected, not defiance, not pleading, just a clear and level accounting of what was in front of her. She was deciding something. I could see that. She was looking at me and deciding whether I was the end of things or not. I held up my left hand, palm out, slow. Then I put my hand to my ear and shook my head once. She looked at me for another 2 or 3 seconds. Then she looked at the older man. Something passed between them, some communication I couldn't read, and the older man's shoulders dropped about a ½ inch, not relaxed, but less coiled. I pointed up through the hatch at the wheelhouse. Then I made a motion with my hand. Come up, I meant, or at least warm yourself. Then I pointed at each of them in turn, making it clear I meant all of them. The woman looked at me again. She had been doing most of the deciding, I could see that, and she made the decision in the way of someone accustomed to having to make them fast and live with the consequences. She turned to the others and said something, and they began to move. Her name was Delia. I didn't learn that until later. I'm telling it now because you should know who she was before I describe what happened, because what happened needs her name attached to it from the beginning. Delia. She was 31 years old, and she had walked most of the way from a plantation in Missouri's Little Dixie region, about 80 miles south and east, through January cold that had been killing cattle. She had organized the escape. She had kept 5 other people alive across 11 days of running. She had found Dolph Vera's Ferry, frozen, and apparently abandoned. And she had got her people onto it, and kept them hidden and kept that fire going in the wheelhouse at exactly the level that might look like wind-caught embers to a casual eye from the bank. She had been doing this alone, making every decision, since the man who'd been guiding them, a conductor on what people were starting to call the railroad, had turned his ankle badly on the 2nd night, and had to be left at a farm north of Lexington with instructions to get word ahead when he could. Word had not come ahead. Delia had kept moving anyway. I didn't know any of this standing in the hold of my boat on that January morning. I'm telling it to you because you need the measure of her from the start. What I knew standing in that hold was that I had 6 people who needed warmth and food and a plan, and that I was now the owner of a boat stuck in the river 14 miles from Kansas, and that if anyone on the bank had been watching when I opened that hatch, there was already a problem I didn't know about. We got them up to the wheelhouse. It was crowded with 6 people and me, but the stove was there, and I let them bank it up properly now, get some real heat going, and I went back to the deck and stood on the ice and looked at the bank. The bank was empty. Harker's Crossing was 300 yards north along the river, and from here you could see the livery and the back end of Greel's post office, and that was about it. No one was moving. The ferryman's shack was between me and the town, and it blocked most of the sightline to the boat. Dolph had been particular about that shack. I'd always thought he just liked his privacy. Now I wondered. I went back to the wheelhouse. The child was asleep against the woman, Delia, already. The girl was holding her hands over the stove and her eyes were half closed, and she was shaking with cold that was only now coming out of her. The older man was watching me. The two younger men were at the small windows, looking out at the bank, and I understood that they had assigned themselves that job and they were serious about it, which told me something. I had a small writing pad in my coat. I always carry one for the Telegraph office when people need to write out their messages, and I wrote on it, "I am the new owner of this boat. I am deaf. No one knows you are here. Are you hurt?" I showed it to Delia. She read it, she looked up at me. Then she held out her hand for the pencil and she wrote, "Two of us have bad feet. Old Thomas has a cough. We need food. How did you get the boat?" I wrote, "The old man who owned it left it to me. He died last week. I didn't know about you." She read that and looked at me again, that same level look calibrating. Then she wrote, "Are you going to help us?" I looked at that question for what felt like a long time. It was not a complicated question, but it was an honest one, and it deserved an honest answer, not a quick one. I wrote, "Yes." She looked at it. Then she looked at me. And I saw something shift in her face, not relief, not softness, something more controlled than either of those. It was the look of a person who has been carrying something very heavy and has just been told they can set it down for a minute. And they're not sure yet if they trust that, but they're willing to try. She nodded once. I went to the ferryman's shack. Dolph had kept a good larder. I don't know that I'd ever been inside his shack before, but I'd have guessed this about him. He was a man who maintained things properly, who didn't let the important preparations slide. There were beans, cornmeal, a side of salt pork wrapped in cloth, dried apples, a sack of coffee, 2 half-full bottles of whiskey, a tin of lard. I loaded what I could carry into a canvas bag I found on the back of the door. I also took his lantern, his spare wool blankets from the chest at the foot of his cot, and his medical kit, which was a tobacco tin with some wrapped bandaging and a bottle of carbolic and a small jar of what turned out to be a camphor salve for the lungs. I carried all of it back to the boat in 2 trips, watching the bank both times. Nobody came. The rest of that day I spent doing 3 things in rotation: feeding them, looking at the ice to judge how much longer before the river broke, and thinking about how to get 6 people across. Missouri at Harker's Crossing runs maybe 300 yards wide. On the Kansas side there was a wagon track that led north to a town called Ellsworth, and from there the railroad had contacts, or had before. I didn't know much about the railroad, only what I'd absorbed from the telegraph traffic over the years, which was more than I should have known and which I'd kept very carefully to myself. Telegraph operators know a great deal that is none of their business. Most of us are good at knowing what to forget. The problem was the ice. The ferry ran on a cable that crossed the river, and in open water you pulled the cable hand over hand or used the current to push the flat bottom at an angle. In ice you couldn't do either. The cable was seized solid. The boat was seized solid. And even if we could get the boat free, driving it through 300 yards of January ice with no engine. The ferry was unpowered, no steam, would be loud enough and slow enough that anyone watching from either bank would have 10 minutes of notice. We needed the ice to break, or we needed another way. I sat with that problem while Delia cooked beans and salt pork on the wheelhouse stove, the smell of it filling the small space in a way that made my mouth water, and made the 2 younger men close their eyes for a moment each, the way people do when something good reaches them after a stretch of nothing. The older man, Thomas, was bad. His cough was the kind that goes deep into the chest and stays there, and the cold was not helping it, and the camphor salve was not enough. I was thinking about Thomas when Delia sat down on the floor of the wheelhouse across from me with 2 tin cups of food, and set one in front of me without ceremony, and began to eat from her own. I ate too. We didn't try to write anything. There was nothing to write yet. The situation was what it was, and we'd both already understood the situation. After a while, she put down her cup and picked up the writing pad. She wrote, "There's a man named Cy Dodd. He knows we got onto a ferry. He has dogs." I looked at that, then I wrote, "How long ago?" She wrote, "We've been on this boat 4 days. He'll have found the trail by now." I wrote, "What kind of man is Dodd?" She held the pencil for a moment, and then she wrote, "The kind that does this for money and likes the work." I knew the type. You didn't work a telegraph office for 11 years without knowing the type. There was a whole commerce in it, men who made their living returning runaways, and the good ones, the ones who got paid most often, were not good men in any other sense of the word. They were patient, and they were thorough, and they were not stopped by much. I wrote how many with him. She wrote when he left the plantation he had 4 men. He may have hired more. I put the pad down and looked out the small wheelhouse window at the ice. The sun was getting low. In another hour it would be dark, and whatever I was going to do tonight had to be figured out before then. The 2 younger men, I would learn their names, were Amos and Burl, brothers, mid-20s, the kind of physical condition that comes from years of fieldwork, had been taking turns watching the bank. Amos came to me now and made a gesture I understood. He was pointing south along the bank, upriver, and then holding up 2 fingers and making a walking motion. 2 men coming from upriver. I went to the window. I could see them at about 400 yards moving along the bank. They weren't hurrying. They were looking at the river. One of them stopped and pointed at the boat. I watched them for about 30 seconds. Then I made a decision. I told Delia in writing fast to get everyone back into the hold. All of them now quiet. I told Amos and Burl to take the hatch bar on the inside when I closed it from the outside, so it would look latched but wouldn't be. I told them I would knock 3 times on the deck above them when it was clear. Then I went and stood on the deck of my ferry and waited. The 2 men came down to the river's edge. They looked at the boat. One of them cupped his hands and called something. I couldn't hear it, obviously, but I could see the shape of it. Likely hailing the boat, asking if anyone was aboard. I gave them a wave, friendly, unhurried. Then I made the universal gesture for a moment, 1 finger up, and went below to the wheelhouse and made a show of banking the stove, fussing around in there, taking my time. When I came back out, I walked to the railing and looked at them. One of them was pointing at the frozen mooring line and saying something. The other one was looking at the boat more carefully, looking at the wheelhouse, looking at the hatch. I reached into my pocket and held up the penny. Then I held up the letter from the territorial office, which I still had on me. I pointed at the penny, pointed at the boat, made a gesture that I hoped read as "This is mine now, I just bought it." They looked at each other. The one doing the most looking at the boat said something to the other one, and the other one replied, and the first one shrugged. Not satisfied exactly, but not sure enough to do something about it. They moved on. I stood on the deck for another 10 minutes after they were out of sight, before I knocked on the deck, planking 3 times. That was the first night. There were 3 more nights like it, sometimes worse, sometimes only the cold and the waiting and the creak of the ice before I had a workable plan. I'm going to tell you what those days were like, because the days are the story, not just what happened at the end of them. The days were like this. I would leave the boat in the early morning before full light and go to the telegraph office and work my shift. 8 hours of telegraph work, messages coming in on the wire in their rhythm that I felt in my fingers and my wrist before I read it with my eyes. I'd been doing it long enough that it was almost automatic, the Morse patterns resolving into words before I consciously decoded them. 8 hours of that, pretending nothing was different. Greel at the post office would pass sometimes and look at me through the window and look away. The 2 men I'd seen on the bank the first night I did not see again, but on the 3rd day, a man came into the telegraph office. He was a thick man, not tall, with a face that had been weathered past the point where age mattered and eyes that were a particular flat gray. He wore a coat that had once been good and wasn't anymore. He came in and stood at the counter and looked at me. Most people who come into the telegraph office write out their message and hand it to me. That's how it works. This man didn't write anything. He just looked at me. I looked back. After a while, he reached into his coat and put a piece of paper on the counter. It was a flyer. Not printed, hand-lettered, with descriptions of 6 people. 2 young men, an older man, a woman, a girl, a small child. There were dollar amounts listed beside each description. The total at the bottom was $850. I read it. I kept my face as flat as the river. Then I looked up at him. He pointed at himself and then made a questioning gesture, you understand, and I pointed at my ear and shook my head. He stared at me for a moment. His flat gray eyes did a kind of calculation that I recognized. I'd seen it in men who were deciding how useful I might be or wasn't. He picked up the flyer and put it back in his coat and walked out. That was Dodd. I didn't go back to the boat until after dark. I took the long way around, coming down from the north end of town along the bank, checking the ground as I went, looking for tracks in the snow that shouldn't have been there. There were none. The moon was up and the ice glowed with it and the boat sat in it like a dark island. When I got aboard and knocked on the hold hatch, Delia came up immediately. She had a look on her face that asked the question before she wrote it. She wrote Dodd was in town today. Thomas saw him from the window. I wrote he came to the office. He doesn't know I can't hear anything from this boat. He may be watching. She wrote we need to move. I wrote the ice is starting to crack upriver. 2 more days, maybe 3. She wrote we may not have 2 days. I sat with that. She was right. The timing was what it was and Dodd was what he was and 2 days might be 1 day too many. I wrote, do you trust your legs? If the ice is thick enough to walk, could your people walk it? She looked at that for a long time. Then she wrote, old Thomas can't walk that far, his feet are bad, the girl's feet too. I wrote, what if I made a sledge? She wrote, from what? I looked around the hold, then I looked up at the wheelhouse. There were planks on the cargo deck that Dolph had stacked there, winterizing, keeping them off the deck's surface. 8-foot planks, sound pine. There was rope. There was the iron anchor from the stern. I wrote, there's material here. I'd need tonight and part of tomorrow. She read that, she looked at me. Then she wrote something and paused before showing it to me. She wrote, why are you doing this? You don't know us. You could send us off your boat and walk away. I held the pad for a moment. It was a fair question. I thought about the honest answer. I wrote, Dolph Vera left me this boat for a penny. I've been trying to figure out why. I think maybe he knew what he was doing, and I think maybe I'm doing what he thought I'd do. She read that twice. Then she looked up at me, and this time the look was different. Not the calculating, not the deciding. It was something quieter, more careful. Like she was seeing something she hadn't expected and was taking the measure of it properly. She wrote, he knew you. I wrote, better than I knew. She set the pad down on her knee and looked out the small porthole for a long time. I didn't interrupt that. Whatever she was doing with it was hers to do. After a while she wrote, my name is Delia. I should have said that on the first day. I wrote Callum and showed her my name. She looked at it and nodded. Then she pointed at the boards stacked on the cargo deck and wrote, show me what you need cut. She was better with the handsaw than I was, as it turned out. Her hands were strong in a way that told you everything about what her life had been, and she worked quickly and without waste. And when she saw what I was doing, she anticipated the next cut without being told. We worked by lantern light until past midnight, the 2 of us, building a flat sledge from Dolph's pine planks with rope harness loops at the front, and runners made from 2 lengths of angle iron I found in the hold, which had probably been meant for some repair Dolph never got to. It was solid work. When it was done, she put her boot on it and rocked it and then looked at me and nodded. I wrote, it'll carry Thomas and the child, and the girl can ride when her feet give out. She wrote, how long to cross the ice at night? I wrote, with the sledge, maybe 2 hours if it holds. She wrote, and if it doesn't hold? I wrote, then we go in the water, and that's the end of it. She looked at that. She didn't flinch from it. That told me something, too. The night before we crossed, I lay in the ferryman's shack and didn't sleep much and thought about Dolph Vera. I thought about the years of spring thaws and the occasional bottle and the way he'd looked at me without making a thing of it. I thought about a man who ran a ferry over a border river for 20 years and kept his own counsel, and apparently kept other things too. I thought about what he might have known that I didn't know I knew yet about myself. A penny is not much of a legacy, but maybe a penny was the point. Here is a thing worth having, and its value is what you make of it. I thought about that a long time. I also thought about Delia. I am going to be straight with you about this, because if I'm not, there's no point telling it at all. I had been alone for a long time. 11 years in a small town where being deaf made you, to most people, either invisible or an inconvenience, and I had accepted that, the way you accept the weather, not happily exactly, but practically. You work with what you have. What I had was my work, which I was good at, and my own company, which I had learned to find sufficient. I had not expected to meet anyone who would make me rethink sufficient. She was not soft, and she was not what you'd call gentle in the ordinary sense of the word. She was too direct for that, too used to needing to be the strongest person in whatever room she was in. But there was a quality to her that I don't have the right word for, something that operated at the same register I operated at. She didn't perform anything. She didn't fuss. She looked at problems and she dealt with them, and when she looked at me straight. Not at the deafness first and then at the man, but at the man. and the deafness was just a thing that was there like the color of my coat. I don't know how to explain how much that matters unless you've spent 11 years without it. I'm not saying I was in love with her by the second night. I'm saying I noticed her in a way I hadn't noticed anyone in a very long time, and that it was complicated, and that I was trying not to let the complication interfere with the work, which was keeping 6 people alive. The morning of the third day the river spoke. I was on the deck of the ferry at first light, a pale January light, the sun still below the horizon but the sky going from black to purple to a gray that held some pink at the edge. And I felt it before I heard it, which for me means I felt it, and that was all I'd ever have of it. A vibration through the deck planking, through my boot soles, deep and rolling. The ice had cracked somewhere upriver. A big crack, the kind that means the river has decided it's done being frozen, and is beginning the slow argument with itself about what comes next. I crouched and put my palm flat on the deck and felt it again. A lower vibration now, something shifting. I went to the hold hatch and knocked, and Delia came up within a minute, reading my face before I could write anything. I wrote tonight. She looked at the river. She stood there at the rail of the frozen boat, and she looked at the Missouri, and she put her hand flat on the rail and felt the same thing I'd felt. Then she turned to me and she nodded. She went below to tell the others. I spent the day at the Telegraph office. I want to tell you about that day, the 8 hours of it, because they were the longest 8 hours I can remember, and every hour of them I was listening, with my hands, with the wire, with whatever part of me had learned to compensate for the thing my ears didn't do to everything around me. 3 messages came through the wire that were not about ferry schedules or land deals. One of them, routed through the office in St. Joseph, was about 6 escaped slaves last seen in the vicinity of the Missouri River in Ray County, and the originating office was in a county seat I knew to be about 30 miles south, and the message was addressed to a county sheriff up near Ellsworth, which was 14 miles north of me on the Kansas side. I wrote that message out by hand in my neat telegraph operator's script, and I filed it in the outgoing tray, and I sat at my key, and I did not send it. I sat at my key, and I did not send it, and I thought about that. I had been a law-abiding man my whole life, or close enough to call myself one. I paid my taxes, I respected property, I did my job. I had not been what you'd call a man of convictions in the sense of convictions you act on. I'd seen the traffic in human beings on the telegraph wire for years, and I'd processed it, and I hadn't done anything about it except keep the wire moving. I told myself the wire was neutral, the way the river was neutral, the way weather was neutral. But sitting at that key with that message in front of me, I couldn't find the neutrality anymore. I'd carried food to 6 people. I'd felt the weight of a small child sleeping against her mother through the planking of the boat. I'd built a sledge in the dark with a woman who didn't ask for more than she needed to know. Whatever neutral had been before, it wasn't available to me now. I did not send the message. At the end of my shift, I took the flimsy from the outgoing tray, and I put it in my coat pocket, and I walked out of the office. I did not look back at the office. I was not going back to the office. I understood this on the walk to the river without having thought it through explicitly. It was just true, the way certain things become true when you cross a line and the line closes behind you. I stopped at the ferryman's shack. I took what was left of Dolph's food and I wrote a note in the shack on the back of a receipt I found on his shelf. The note said, "The boat is mine and I've taken it across. You can have the rest." It was addressed to no one, and it said what it needed to say and no more. It was just past dark when I got to the boat. I knocked once on the hull below the waterline, the signal we'd agreed on, and within 5 minutes everyone was up and on deck. Thomas was white-faced and moving very slowly. One of the young men, Burl, with an arm under his, and the girl, whose name was Macy and who was Thomas's granddaughter, had her arm around the little boy, whose name was James, and who was 4 years old, and who had the particular solemn gravity of small children who have been frightened past the point of showing it. The sledge was on the deck. I'd put it together that afternoon before my shift, loading it with the food sack, the blankets, the medical tin, everything we could carry that wasn't nailed down. There was a rope at the front for pulling, and I had coiled a 50-foot safety line that I planned to run between all of us, so that if the ice went, we'd at least go together instead of separately. Delia looked at all of it. She looked at the ice. Then she looked at me. I wrote on the pad in the lantern light, "South Bank is not an option. North Bank then east to the Kansas line. The track to Ellsworth is about 4 miles north of where we'll land." I know a man at a farm on the way who can be trusted, I think. She looked at I think and pointed at it. I wrote his name is Hendricks. I've sent his messages for years. Some of them I wasn't supposed to read. She thought about that, then she wrote good enough. I rigged the safety line from my belt to hers to Amos, and then back through the others, each of them a knot apart with enough slack to walk but not enough to lose each other in the dark. I took the front of the sledge rope. Burl took the back. Delia was between Thomas and Macy. I stepped off the boat onto the ice. It held. I want to tell you about crossing the Missouri on foot in January in the dark because I think about it still. Not often, not every day, but on certain winter nights when the cold has a particular quality to it. When the sky is clear and the stars are the same stars, I think about that crossing. I think about the feel of the ice under my boots, the subtle give of it in places, the vibration that sometimes came up through it from the river running black and cold underneath. I couldn't hear if the ice was cracking. I never can hear that, the sharp reports of it, but I could feel the change in the vibration through the soles of my boots, and twice I stopped us and made us go around a place that felt wrong. And both times when I looked back, the ice had given in those spots. The stars were extraordinary. That sounds like the kind of thing a man puts in a story to make it feel large, but it was simply true. It was one of those nights when the cold has cleared the air completely, and the sky is so full of light that it seems to press down, close enough to touch. I was watching it as much as I was watching the ice, because both told me things. 30 minutes in, Delia pulled the safety line. 2 short tugs, we'd worked out signals, which meant look back. I turned. She was crouched down beside Thomas, who had stopped. His cough had taken him, the deep kind, and it was shaking him, and Burl was holding him up, and Macy had her grandfather's hand in both of hers, and little James was standing perfectly still beside her with his hand in her pocket. I went back. Thomas was on his knees by the time I reached him. His face in the starlight was terrible to look at, the effort of containing that cough, the cold making it worse. I crouched in front of him. He looked at me. Old Thomas had the kind of face that has taken a great deal in silence over a long time, and has arrived somewhere on the far side of complaint, somewhere spare and stripped down to what matters. And what his face said right then was that he was sorry for slowing us down, and he was not going to ask to stop. I took his arm, and Burl took the other, and we got him up. Then I unclipped the sledge rope from my belt and gave it to Amos, and I put Thomas's arm around my neck, and we went on. We were 150 yards from the north bank when the ice shifted. Not broke, shifted. A deep roll in it, a settling, and I felt it come up through both feet at once, and for a moment, maybe 2 or 3 seconds, nothing happened and I didn't breathe. Then it settled again and stayed. We were standing on ice that was still there. Nobody moved for those 2 or 3 seconds. Then Delia, behind me, put her hand once on my back flat between my shoulder blades and held it there for about a second. It wasn't fear and it wasn't sentiment. It was, I feel it too, we're still here. Go. We went. We made the north bank at just past 8 o'clock. I know because there was a farmhouse light about a quarter mile in from the bank, and through the window I could see a clock on a shelf. One of those things you notice because you've trained yourself to read information from windows in the dark. 8:03, 3 hours from when we'd left the boat. The farmhouse was not Hendricks. This was closer, a place I didn't know. I kept us away from it, moving through the tree line parallel to the river, going east toward the wagon track that would take us north. The cold was bad by then. Thomas was almost nothing against my side, just weight and breath, and the weight of him told me his legs were not doing much work. Macy had taken James on her back, the boy's legs wrapped around her waist, and she was walking on feet she didn't say anything about. Nobody said anything about anything. We moved. I have thought since about what those people were made of. I know what I am made of roughly from the evidence of my life, and what I am made of is not nothing, but it is not that. Whatever that was, the quality of people who have been stripped of everything except the will to keep going and have found that the will is enough. Delia had built something in those 11 days of running, built it out of necessity, but what she had built held. All 6 of them were inside it. I was not inside it the same way. I was the man on the outside of it, holding the edges down. That was fine. That was work I knew how to do. The wagon track was where I expected it to be, a pale line north through the trees. We turned onto it. I shifted Thomas to Amos and Burl and moved to the front of the group to read the track ahead. It was about a mile to Hendricks' farm. A mile on a frozen track in January with two people who were half broken, and a child is not a mile in any usual sense of the word. It is a mile that has to be gotten through decision by decision, 20 steps at a time, and then the next 20, and the ground is what it is, and the cold is what it is, and you deal with that, and then the next thing. I know because that was what I was doing. 3/4 of the way there, Delia came up beside me. She walked alongside me for a minute without writing anything just there, and then she wrote on the pad she was carrying, "You're limping." I hadn't known that. I looked at my right boot. The sole had separated at the toe. I'd felt something earlier and hadn't assessed it fully. And the cold was coming up through the gap, and my foot had gone numb far enough that the walking had gone strange. I wrote, "I'm fine." She stopped and grabbed my arm and looked at me. She had a look that did not accept that answer. I wrote after Hendrix. She kept looking at me. Then she wrote, "I'll look at it at Hendrix." We went on. Hendrix Farm was a lamp in a window at the end of a lane, and I had Delia and the others wait back in the tree line while I went up to the door. I knocked, waited, knocked again. The man who opened the door had a lamp in one hand and a shotgun in the other, and he looked at me, and then past me at the darkness, and then back at me, and his face went through a rapid series of things. He knew me. I could see that. He knew me from the telegrams, and he was doing a very fast calculation about what a deaf telegraph operator was doing at his door in the middle of a January night. I handed him a note I'd written on the track. It said, "6 people in your tree line. They need shelter, warmth, food, and then passage north. I will owe you a debt that I will pay. I need you to say yes." He read it. He looked at me. His mouth moved, and I caught the shape of 2 words that I thought were "do you," and then something I missed. He held up one finger and went back inside and was gone for 2 minutes. Then he came back with a lantern and nodded at me and walked past me toward the trees. He was a good man. He had always struck me as a good man through the wire, which is an unconventional way to know someone, but it had been enough. Inside the farmhouse, there was a stove and warmth and a woman who turned out to be Hendrix's wife, and who did not seem remotely surprised by any of it, who simply counted heads and went to the kitchen and started heating things. I watched her do this, the practiced efficiency of it, the absence of theater, and I thought about the kind of life that prepares you to be ready for 6 strangers at your door in winter without losing your composure. And I thought it was probably a life with a lot of things in it that people who lived easier lives didn't know about. Hendrix's wife, her name was Alma, sat Thomas in the chair nearest the stove and got his boots off and looked at his feet and looked at Macy's feet and did not say, to her credit, anything about what she saw. She worked on them with warm water and the care of someone who'd done it before. I watched Thomas's face while she did this, the working of it, the effort to contain what he was feeling, and then the moment he stopped containing it and just sat there with tears running down his face in complete silence. An old man who had walked farther than he should have been able to walk in January to be free. And it was Macy who put her arms around him and held him, the girl holding the old man, and I turned away from it because it was not mine to look at. Delia found me in the corner of the room. She sat down on the floor beside me. We were both on the floor, the chairs and the bench being occupied. And she had a bowl of something, soup or stew, and she handed me a piece of bread and pointed at my boot. I took the boot off. The sole was separated about 3 inches at the toe, and when my sock came off, it took some work. The sock had frozen to the boot leather, and I'd known it was bad but hadn't known how bad. I could see the beginning of frostbite on 2 toes. She looked at it without expression, and then she looked at Alma and said something, and Alma came with a basin of warm water and a cloth, and Delia did what she did with the same matter-of-fact competence she brought to everything. It is a specific thing, a person caring for your feet. It's not a grand thing. There's nothing romantic about cold feet in a farm kitchen in January. But she had her hands around my foot in that basin, and she was working carefully, warming the skin back, checking the toes, and after a while she looked up at me and her face was close. We were both bending down toward the basin, and she looked at me the way she'd looked at me on the boat when I'd written "Yes, I'll help you," that careful taking of measure, but it was different now. I don't know how to say it differently than that. It was the same look, but it had something added to it. I wrote on the pads, "Thank you." She looked at that, then she wrote quickly, "You built the sledge." I wrote, "You made it worth building." She stopped writing. She was still holding my foot in the warm water, and she stopped and looked at me, and there was a moment. I don't know how long, not long, but it was its own thing inside the ordinary time of that farmhouse kitchen, and she held it that moment, and so did I. Then she wrote, "We need to keep moving north. Hendricks says he knows the next conductor." I wrote, "I know. How much time do we have?" She wrote, "Dodd will have found the boat by morning." I wrote, "Then we go before morning." She nodded. She wrapped my foot in a dry cloth from Alma's basket and put my boot back on and stood up. "I want to stay here." I didn't write. I wrote, "I'll talk to Hendricks about the route." That was the most honest I could be in that moment, and I knew it was only partly honest, and I let it go and went to find Hendricks. He had a map. Farmers in the border country all had maps, not official maps, not the ones you'd find in a courthouse, but hand-drawn maps of who to trust and who not to trust, and where the crossings were, and which sheriffs had dogs and which ones didn't, maps that would have been evidence of something serious if the wrong person found them. He spread his on the kitchen table and pointed things out, and I read his lips as best I could, and what I missed he wrote, and we worked out a route that would get us to the next contact by dawn if we left within the hour. I asked him about himself, in writing directly, "Are you safe here after this?" He looked at that question for a moment and then he wrote back, "I've been doing this 9 years. It's never safe. I'm still here." 9 years. I'd been sending his messages for 8 of them, and I hadn't known and he hadn't told me. 2 men who'd never met, working at opposite ends of the same wire. We left an hour before dawn. All 6 of the runaways and me, Hendricks walking us as far as the edge of his property and then stopping, standing in the dark at the fence line. And as we moved away into the dark, he raised his hand once and I raised mine back, and that was that. The route north took us through bottomland timber along a creek, mostly frozen, and then up through a stretch of open prairie that I didn't love. Open ground is open ground. And then into a woodlot that Hendricks had marked on the map, with a barn on the far end that was owned by a Quaker family named Beale, and that was the next station. The bottomland timber was slow going. Macy was on the sledge by then, riding with James, her feet wrapped and propped up, and Amos and Burl took turns on the rope. Thomas was walking, better than before. Something had come back into him with the warmth and the food, a kind of stubbornness that was not going to let itself be undone. He was walking on his own, slowly, but his own. Delia walked beside me through the timber. The creek ice cracked sometimes under our feet, small cracks, not dangerous. And the trees were bare and black against the sky, which was beginning, very faintly, to lighten in the east. She wrote on the pad, walking, "What will you do after?" I wrote, "I don't know. I've worked that telegraph office 11 years. She wrote, "Not anymore." I wrote, "Not anymore." We walked for a minute without writing, and then she wrote, "Is there anywhere you'd go?" I wrote, "I've never thought about it that way. I've always been where the work was." She wrote, "The work's going to be different now." I wrote, "I know." She wrote, "I know some people north of here. In Iowa, good people, a settlement with a school. They need anyone willing to work." I wrote, "What kind of work?" She wrote, "Any kind. The school needs a teacher. The farms need hands. The telegraph line goes through there now, I think." I wrote, "Why are you telling me this?" She stopped walking. She turned and faced me in the timber in the dark, and she held up the pad and she wrote carefully, "Because I'm going to be there. And I think you should be there too." I looked at that. I held the lantern up a little so I could see her face, and she let me look. She had the look on her face that she got when she'd made a decision, not soft, not uncertain, just settled. A woman who'd made up her mind and was telling me plainly what she'd decided. I wrote, "I'll come." She looked at that, then she looked at me. I wrote, "When did you decide this?" She wrote, "On the boat, when you wrote yes. Not the yes to helping us, the one after, when I asked why you were doing it and you wrote about the penny and Dolph Vera. I decided then." I held the lantern and looked at her, and the bare trees were black around us, and the sky was going from dark to dark gray to something that would eventually be light. And somewhere in that future light was Kansas and Iowa and a telegraph line, and a settlement with a school and a future I had not imagined an hour ago. She started walking again. I walked with her. We made the Beale farm at first light. The barn was warm, there were cattle in it, and the smell of livestock and hay and the warmth of animal breath hit us when we pulled the door open and the 6 of them went in, and the relief in their bodies was something you could see all the way through, a kind of unclenching. The woman of the Beale family, tall, gray-haired, Quaker plain, met us at the barn door, and she looked at all of us, And then she looked at me and she wrote, without preamble, on a slate she had in her hand, "Thee has done good work this night." I looked at that. I didn't know what to say to it. I wrote, "There were others." She wrote, "There always are. They fed us. They let us sleep in the hay, which was the warmest I'd been in 3 days, and I slept hard and without dreaming, which for me is the best kind of sleep there is. When I woke it was mid-morning, and the barn was lit by slats of pale winter sun coming through the gaps in the wall boards, and it was quiet in the way of places where everyone else is also sleeping. I lay in the hay and looked at the light for a while. Delia was asleep about 6 feet from me on her side, facing the wall. I could see the rise and fall of her breathing. She had one arm folded under her head for a pillow and the other arm curled around James, who had somehow migrated from wherever he'd started to being tucked against her back in the way that small children attach to warmth. Macy was asleep against Thomas, who was on his back with his hands folded on his chest like a man in a coffin, except that he was breathing steadily, and the terrible grayness was out of his face. Amos and Burl were not in the barn. I found them outside in the cold, sitting on the fence rail, watching the road, 2 men who apparently didn't stop watching even when the situation warranted it. When I came out, Amos looked at me and gave a single nod, and I gave one back, and that was conversation enough. In the afternoon, the Beale family's eldest son came to the barn with news. He wrote it on the slate and handed it to me. A man named Dodd had been seen in Harker's Crossing, asking about a deaf telegraph operator, asking about the ferry. He had 4 men with him and dogs. I sat with that for a moment, then I wrote on the slate how far back. He wrote half a day maybe. Half a day was not enough and not too little. It was what it was. I went to wake Delia. She was already awake, lying there with her eyes open, looking at the ceiling of the barn. I crouched down beside her and she sat up immediately, fully alert the way people are who have been sleeping with one ear open for 11 days. I handed her the slate. She read it, she looked up at me. I took the slate and wrote, "We need to push north today. There's another contact 10 miles up. Hendricks wrote it on the map. Can your people walk 10 miles? She looked at the barn, at Thomas, at Macy, at the sleeping child. Then she looked back at me and wrote, "Thomas and Macy ride the sledge. The rest of us walk." I wrote, "Your feet." She wrote, "My feet are fine." I wrote, "Your feet are not fine." She gave me a look that contained several opinions about my observation, and then she wrote, "Callum, my feet have been walking since Missouri and they will walk 10 more miles. What we need is to go." It was the first time she'd written my name. I noticed that. I wrote, "All right, after we eat." She wrote, "After we eat." We ate at the Beale table, the whole family, all 6 of them and all 8 of us, and it was a meal I've thought about since. Not for the food, which was good but plain, but for the shape of it. That table. The Beale family, quiet, gray-clad, entirely matter-of-fact about what they were doing and why. Delia at the end of the table saying something to James, who was eating very seriously, and then suppressing a smile at whatever James said back. Thomas eating with both hands wrapped around his bowl. Macy asleep sitting upright between bites and startling awake and eating again. I sat at that table and I ate and I looked at all of it and I thought, I have never been at a table that mattered more than this one. I have never eaten a meal that was more necessary. We left the Beale farm at midday. The Quaker woman came to the barn door when we left, and she put her hand briefly on Delia's arm and on mine, and then she went back inside without ceremony, and we went north. The 10 miles were hard. The prairie wind had picked up and it came from the northwest with conviction, driving dry snow horizontal, and we walked into it with our heads down and our coats pulled up, and I counted steps the way you do when steps are all you can think about. The sledge went better on packed snow than it had on the ice, Thomas and James sitting on it, and Macy for the second half of the distance, and Amos and Burl taking turns on the rope with a kind of grim rotation that asked nothing from anyone else. Delia walked beside me for most of it. We didn't write anything. There wasn't much to write. The wind was the wind, and the cold was the cold, and the next contact was ahead, and Dodd was behind, and the arithmetic of it was simple, and all we had to do was the next step and the one after. About 4 miles in, she put her hand briefly on my arm, not stopping, just a touch, the way you touch someone when you want them to know you're still there. I put my hand over hers for a moment. That was all. We walked on. The contact north was a woman farmer, a widow named Prewitt, who ran a 120-acre spread alone since her husband died of a fever 3 years prior, and who, I later learned, had been a conductor for 5 years, and had passed more people north than she could count. She met us at the gate of her farm like she was expecting us, which she was, because Hendricks had sent word ahead on another route, and she looked us over with the eye of a woman who does a necessary thing and does it well and doesn't waste time on sentiment about it. She put Thomas and Macy in the house in the warm bedroom. She put the rest of us in her hayloft, which was clean and dry and had 4 good wool blankets in it and a second lantern, which told you it was a room she'd prepared for exactly this purpose. That evening, after the others slept, Delia and I sat in the hayloft with the lantern between us and we talked. I mean, we wrote back and forth in the slow way of writing where you have to finish a thought fully before you give it over, which sometimes makes you more precise and sometimes more honest than you'd be with words. She wrote first, "Tell me about being deaf." No one had ever written that to me before. People asked about it in ways that were really asking about themselves, what it meant for them, how it would affect their interaction with me, what allowances they should make. She asked about it as if it were something about me that she wanted to understand. I wrote, I lost it gradually from about age 10 to about age 15, a fever that kept coming back. The last of it went when I was 15 and I was in school and the teacher was writing on the board and I realized I couldn't hear the chalk anymore. She wrote, "Were you afraid?" I wrote, not of being deaf. I was afraid of what people would do about it. People mostly confirmed my fears. My father told me I'd never hold a real job. He was wrong about that one. She wrote, "What happened to him?" I wrote, "He died. He was not a good man. I don't mean this unkindly. He was afraid most of his life and it came out as contempt. I've tried not to be that." She wrote, "You're not that." I wrote, "You've known me 4 days." She wrote, "I know the kind of person who builds a sledge in the dark for people they've never met. You know, what kind of person doesn't do that?" I wrote, "Most people." She wrote, "Yes." I held that for a moment. Then I wrote, "Tell me about Delia." She looked at that. She turned the pad over in her hands, and then she turned it back, and she wrote slowly, more slowly than she usually wrote, "Born in Missouri. Chattel legally from the first breath. My mother was a woman named Ruth who could read, which was illegal, and she taught me in the dark of the cabin by touch on a flat board before I was old enough to know that was remarkable. I've been reading since I was 4. I wrote, "Your mother." She wrote, "She died when I was 16. She was not an old woman. She was not treated as one. She asked for a doctor when she was sick and they told her she was faking. She was not faking. She died in the cabin." I held the pad and looked at what she'd written and I didn't write anything for a moment. Then I wrote, "I'm sorry." She wrote, "I think about her every day. I think about whether she would be glad of this, what we're doing. I think she would. She liked movement. She used to say still water goes bad." I wrote, "Still water goes bad." She wrote, "Yes." We sat with that for a while in the lamplight of the hayloft, the wind going outside, the others asleep. Then she wrote, "I want to ask you something and I want you to tell me honestly." I wrote, "All right." She wrote, "After Iowa, what do you actually want?" I looked at that question. It was not a question I'd been in the habit of asking myself. What I wanted had been, for a long time, a quiet day and a steady key and enough to eat, which is not nothing but is also not a life in the full sense of the word. I wrote, "I want to not be invisible." She looked at that. She wrote, "You're not invisible to me." I wrote, "I know." She wrote, "Is that enough?" I wrote, "It's more than I've had." She wrote, "That's not an answer." I wrote, "No." She wrote, "So." I wrote, "I want what you said. Iowa. The work, whatever it is, the people I want, and this is plain, I'm being plain, I want the chance to know you better and to be known by you and to see what that becomes. If that's a thing you're willing for." She read that. She held the pad for a long time. The lantern between us put her face in warm light and shadow, and she was looking at what I'd written with the expression she got when she was deciding something that mattered. Then she looked up at me and she wrote, "Callum. I organized 11 people into an escape. I walked 80 miles in January. I kept a sick old man alive and a child alive and 2 strong young men who were ready to run ahead from running ahead. I've been making every decision for 3 weeks alone, and I have not been wrong yet about a single one of them." I wrote, "I know." She wrote, "I don't say this to boast. I say it so you understand that I do not make decisions carelessly. I decided about you on the boat." I wrote the yes. She wrote the yes, and I have not changed my mind once since then. So if you're asking me if I'm willing, yes, I am willing. I decided. I don't undecide things. I wrote, I don't either. She wrote, good, then that is settled and we can sleep. I looked at her. She had the look of a woman who has said a thing that needed saying and has said it cleanly and is done with it. And there was something in it that was also amused, not laughing, but the edge of it. The edge of a woman who has just handed a man a clear answer and is watching him figure out what to do with it. I wrote, you're going to be difficult. She wrote, you have no idea. She took the lantern and set it down in the corner on low and lay back in the hay and was asleep, or performing sleep very convincingly, within about 2 minutes. I lay back too. I looked at the hayloft ceiling, the old barn boards, the hay pushed up into the peak, the faint light from the lantern catching the dust in the air, and I felt something that I didn't have a clean name for. Not happiness exactly, because the situation was still what it was and Dodd was still a half day behind us, and we were still in the border country in January. But something that had not been there before. Something that felt like the answer to a question I'd been carrying so long I'd stopped noticing the weight of it. We left Prewitt's farm in the gray morning. She gave us provisions and a better map, and she shook each of our hands at the gate, including mine, firmly, looking me in the eye, and she said something I didn't catch, and I held up my hand for what did you say, and she held up one finger and went back in the house and came out with a piece of paper. It said, Dolph Vara brought 4 people through here 2 years ago. He said there'd be someone after him. I'm glad it was you. I read that 3 times. I folded it carefully and put it in my breast pocket next to the penny. The road north was better, packed and clear. The wind gone. The sky a hard pale blue the way it gets in January after the worst of a cold spell breaks. Not warm, but settled. Thomas was on the sledge again, and James was beside him. And at one point, about 2 miles in, Thomas began to tell James something. I could see him talking, his hands moving, James's face going from solemn to intent to, eventually, a child's version of a grin. And I watched them, and I thought about all the years of things that had been taken from Thomas, and what it meant that he was here in this pale blue January morning on a sledge in Kansas, telling a small boy a story. We made the Iowa line in the late afternoon of the 5th day. I know because there was a stone marker in a field, half buried in snow, and Amos walked up to it and put his hand on it and stood there for a moment and then looked back at the rest of us, and he didn't say anything. I couldn't hear it anyway, but his face said what it needed to say, and Burl walked up beside him, and they both stood there. Delia was beside me. She looked at the stone. Then she put her hand in mine. I held her hand. That was it. That was the moment. Standing in a field in Iowa in January with a stone in the ground, and 6 people who'd walked more miles than they should have been able to walk, and her hand in mine, and the sky still that hard pale blue going toward the orange of late afternoon along the western horizon, and the cold, the clean cold of a place where you are as far north of the worst of it as you can get for now. I held her hand and I stood there, and I was the steadiest I had been in a long time. The settlement was called New Hope, which is perhaps too on the nose for a name, but the people who named it were serious about the idea, and the seriousness forgave the literalness. It was about 40 acres of organized life, houses, a meeting hall, a school building, a forge, a general store, a small infirmary. About 130 people, and more coming. They had a telegraph line. It came in from the east and ran through the relay station at the edge of town, and there was a small office built onto the side of the meeting hall. I walked in there 2 days after we arrived, and I looked at the key and the equipment, and I put my hand on the equipment and felt the faint current in it. The man in charge of the settlement, a careful, gray-haired man named Farwell, had taken me aside the first evening and asked me, in writing, what my skills were and how I could contribute. I told him, telegraph operator, 11 years experience. He had looked at the key in the corner of the meeting hall with the expression of a man who had needed someone for a specific job for longer than was comfortable. I started work the next morning. The work was the same and not the same. The same in the mechanics of it, the code, the key, the rhythm in my hands, the translation. Not the same because the messages were different. Not land deals and lawyers' correspondence, not the commerce of people who already had what they needed and were building more of it. The messages here were about passage and safety, and who could be trusted 300 miles south, and which road was watched, and which ferry was safe, and what names to use, and how many were coming and when. Information that mattered in a way that land prices did not. I was good at it, I had always been good at it, but good at it here meant something different. The school was in a building next to the meeting hall, and Delia was in it the first morning before the rest of the settlement was fully awake. She taught reading and arithmetic and geography, and I gathered from the slate board something about the laws and rights and how they were supposed to work and how they actually worked and what the difference meant. I looked in through the window once. She would have told me not to. She had opinions about being watched while she worked, and the faces of the children were the same as James's face on the sledge, not solemn anymore but intent, learning. She was a teacher in the way that people are teachers when they learn to read on a flat board in the dark, and have never forgotten what it meant to have that gift given. I did not watch through the window for long. I went back to my key. We ate together in the evenings in the settlement's common dining room, sometimes with others, sometimes not. We talked, in our way, the writing and the reading, which had its own rhythm now, which we'd gotten good at, which was as much a conversation as any I'd ever had with someone I could hear. She had a dry humor that surfaced mostly at her own expense and occasionally at mine. And I had a tendency to over-explain things that she found amusing in a particular way. She had, not mocking, but precisely calibrated amusement that let me know I was doing it. I was doing it less the longer we knew each other. There was a night in late February, still cold, but the quality of the cold was different, the season shifting somewhere under it, when we were the last ones in the dining room and the lamp was burning low, and she was marking her students' slates, and I was reading, and neither of us had written anything for a while. At one point, I looked up from my book, and she was looking at me. Not with any of the calculating looks, not deciding anything, just looking at me the way you look at something you've looked at a lot and are still glad to look at. I set down my book. She wrote what? I wrote nothing, just looking at you looking at me. She wrote I wrote and I'm not complaining. She shook her head once, suppressing the smile, and went back to her slates. I went back to my book. We were married in May, in the settlement's meeting hall, with the whole 130 people there plus 20-odd new arrivals including Thomas and Macy. Thomas walking on his own now, moving slow but moving, and James in his good shirt looking like a very serious small diplomat. Farwell conducted the ceremony, which was simple and serious and suited us. Amos and Burl had gone north to Minnesota by then, following news of land there. They'd been gone a month. The morning they left, Amos had come to me and written on my pad, "You're a good man, Callum." Then he'd clapped me on the shoulder once hard, the kind of handshake that uses a shoulder instead, and they'd gone. I thought about that a lot. At the ceremony, Delia wore a dress that Alma Hendricks had sent north with a circuit rider, blue wool, plain cut, which was exactly right. She stood beside me at the front of the meeting hall, and she held my hand, and when it was time, she turned and faced me, and she looked at me with a look that was not the boat look or the deciding look or any of the looks I'd catalogued. It was a new look. It was the look of someone who has made a decision and arrived at the far side of the making of it, and the far side is good. I held her hand, I looked back. The penny from Dolph Vera's ferry was in my breast pocket. I keep it there still. It is the only inheritance I have ever received that was worth the having, and the worth of it is not the boat or the river or even the 11 days of frost and dark and walking, though those were mine and I'll keep them every step. The worth of it is what those things were the beginning of. A good woman who sees you clearly and chooses you anyway. That is what the penny bought. I don't know if Dolph knew all of it. Maybe he didn't. Maybe he just thought he was passing on a useful piece of property to a reliable man. But I think about the ferry he used to run, and the messages that came through my wire for 9 years, and the conductor in the Prewitt farm note. And I think maybe Dolph Vera knew exactly what a penny was worth, and exactly what kind of man he was leaving it to. I hope wherever he is, the river is running clear. It's running clear here. I'll take it.